The night in Chicago felt forged from iron and silence. The wind sliced through the streets like a blade, and the yellowish glow of the streetlights flickered under the weight of a fog that refused to lift. I walked with my hands stuffed into the pockets of my worn-out coat, trying to hold on to a bit of warmth and dignity after another shift at the diner. The tables were empty, the tips were scarce, and the weary looks of the customers seemed to mirror the same despair I carried in my chest. Winter had a cruel knack for making everything harder. Even the simple act of believing tomorrow might be different. The streets of the South Side were known for their broken corners and storefronts that had long given up on dreaming. Each step echoed between the damp buildings, as if the city itself watched in silence the fate of those who dared to walk alone at that hour. I had no choice. The last bus had already passed, and the coins in my pocket wouldn't cover a taxi. I hurried through the alleys, trusting more in haste than in caution. The cold stung my skin and turned the air into a kind of liquid pain that I breathed in with effort. Back then, I still believed chance was just a detail of life, that bad things happened because they were meant to, not because someone, somewhere, moved them like pieces on an invisible chessboard. I didn't know that on that night, fate was waiting for me in an alley, disguised as tragedy. As I cut through a shortcut between two abandoned buildings, I heard a strange, muffled sound, like a groan trying to be forgotten. Instinct made me stop. My heart raced, not from fear, but from that involuntary curiosity that stirs when the soul senses something is about to change. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust to the dimness. That's when I saw him, a body sprawled in the snow, his breathing shallow, blood staining the white ground like living ink. I took a step back, startled, and for a moment I wanted to run, but something stronger made me stay. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 15 or 16, was dressed in clothes far too expensive for that place. A fine wool coat, a gleaming wristwatch, a precise haircut. A son of someone important, no doubt. His skin was cold, his pulse weak. Fear gave way to urgency. Without thinking, I tore the hem of my apron and pressed it against the wound. "Hey, can you hear me?" I whispered, my voice trembling as much as my hands. No response. The blood wouldn't stop. I frantically searched for something to help. That's when I found the phone in his coat pocket. The cracked screen displayed only one contact, saved as Padre. That simple name seemed to carry a force that pushed me forward. I pressed the call button. The phone rang only once. "Who is this?" A voice answered, deep, firm, with a subtle Italian accent. A tone that seemed unfamiliar with fear. I found a boy, injured. He's bleeding, unconscious. This number was on his phone. Silence. Then, the question that would change everything. Where are you? I hesitated for a moment, looked around, and described the nearest corner, the broken neon sign of a store still glowing red. The voice on the other end showed neither surprise nor gratitude, only a command. "Don't move," and the call ended. The time that followed felt like an eternity suspended. I stayed kneeling in the snow, holding that piece of fabric against the wound, while the city around me seemed to hold its breath. No cars passed, no windows opened, only the distant sound of a siren that never arrived. Until, suddenly, the silence broke. A low rumble of heavy engines approached. I saw lights reflect off the pool of blood, and for a moment, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Black cars emerged like tangible shadows, gliding down the narrow street. The doors opened in sync, and men in dark suits stepped out with measured steps. None of them seemed fazed by the scene. One, the tallest, approached slowly, his gaze fixed on the unconscious boy. There was something in the way he moved, a dangerous calm, a presence that made the air feel heavy. "Step back," he said, and even without raising his voice, my skin prickled. I stood trembling, my knees stiff from the cold and fear. The other men parted as he knelt beside the boy. That's when I saw him clearly, the man everyone seemed to defer to, Vincenzo Moretti. A name I'd later hear whispered in corners, feared in alleys, and revered in the city's most exclusive clubs, the Don. He touched his son's face with a tenderness that felt out of place in that grim scene. His eyes, dark as wet coal, scanned the wound with precision and contained rage. Every movement was deliberate. Around him, the guards waited in silence, alert, as if the entire world hung on his will. I didn't know what to do. Stay, run, apologize for existing, until his gaze lifted and found me. It wasn't an ordinary look. It was the kind that pierced through layers of fear, lies, and soul. I felt exposed. He studied me as if trying to discern whether fate had gifted or threatened him. No one spoke, just the sound of the wind and the boy's heavy breathing. You found him like this? He asked, his voice low, almost a murmur. Yes. He was still breathing. I tried to help. That brief moment seemed to last a lifetime. Vincenzo stood, wiping the blood on his black glove, and took a step closer. He was close enough for me to smell the tobacco and expensive leather. He looked at me with something like indecision. He wasn't used to being surprised by strangers. As the men began to carry the boy away, he stood still in front of me. The wind tugged at his coat, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to soften. But what came was a pronouncement, spoken like an ancient law. Whoever saves a Moretti is never the same person again. And then he was gone. No thanks, no promises, just that phrase that clung to me like an invisible tattoo. I stood there, surrounded by the echo of retreating engines and the silence that remained. The alley felt different now, as if I'd crossed a portal. As I walked home, the cold wasn't just winters anymore, but the chill of a change I didn't yet understand. Each step was accompanied by the memory of his voice, the intensity of a gaze that seemed to have marked something inside me. That night, I barely slept. I dreamed of blood on snow, dark eyes watching me, and the feeling that, somehow, I'd touched something I shouldn't have. The next morning, the newspaper spoke of a shootout between rival families in the North Side. One name kept appearing between the lines, Moretti. I sighed, trying to convince myself it had nothing to do with me, but deep down I knew. His words still echoed, pulsing in the silence of my small apartment. Before continuing, if this story is resonating with you, take a moment to subscribe, like, and comment. Your support makes all the difference in allowing us to keep sharing stories like this. In the days that followed, life tried to resume its course. I returned to the diner, washed dishes, served coffee, and forced smiles. But a shadow lingered in every gesture. At times, I swore I saw a black car parked at the corner. Other times, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, though it remained silent. It was as if something watched me, as if the world around me had gained a new rhythm. Slow, calculated, dangerous. 3 days later, when the phone finally rang, I already knew it would be him. I can't explain it. I just felt it. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself. It simply said my name, as if confirming an ancient intuition. Elena Duarte. My heart skipped a beat. Yes, who's this? You saved the life of someone important to me, and now, fate demands we meet again. His voice was the same as before, deep, cold, controlled, but there was something new, a tension time doesn't erase. He didn't ask if I wanted to meet, just gave the time and place. Before I could respond, the call ended. It was then, staring at the silent phone, that I realized fate hadn't finished with me that night. It had only begun to pull me into a world from which no one emerges unscathed. And even without understanding, a part of me, the part that always sought something beyond survival, knew I would go. The sun that morning felt different, paler, as if even it hesitated to rise fully. The distant sound of trains echoed through the city, mingling with the constant whistle of wind slipping through the cracks of my small apartment's window. I sat at the table, a mug of cold coffee in front of me, trying to convince my mind that the call from the previous night was just an echo of exhaustion, an illusion born of sleepless nights. But deep down, I knew nothing in that man's voice could be forgotten. At 10 o'clock sharp, I heard a firm knock at the door. The sound rang with authority, 3 times, as if the walls themselves recognized the importance of who waited outside. When I opened it, 2 men in dark suits stared at me with an almost military neutrality. No smiles, no greetings. Just a short sentence. Miss Duarte, Mr. Moretti requests that you accompany us. My heart raced. That name coursed through me like a memory both warm and cold. I wanted to refuse, to say I had work, that I owed nothing to anyone. But their presence at my door made it clear there was no room for refusal. I grabbed my coat, the same one from that fateful night, and let them lead me. The car was black, impeccable, the interior smelling of leather and silence. The tinted windows isolated me from the outside world, and for a moment, I felt as if I were being taken not to a place, but to a destiny charted without my consent. The streets I once knew looked different from there, more distant, more unreal. When the car finally stopped in front of a tall, ornate iron gate, I realized I'd crossed an invisible boundary. From that moment on, nothing would be the same. The Moretti mansion loomed like a monument to power, vast, ancient, with immense windows and marble columns reflecting the cold winter light. The gate opened silently, and the car glided down an avenue lined with cypresses. Armed men stood watch discreetly, their presence as imposing as the silence that reigned there. It was as if the very atmosphere of the house had been shaped to inspire obedience. Inside, I was greeted by a middle-aged woman, elegant and precise in her movements. Her face was the kind that allowed no weaknesses. "Miss Duarte, Mr. Moretti is waiting for you in his office." Her voice was firm, professional, but there was something in her eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps compassion, that made me feel this invitation was more a sentence than an honor. The hallway seemed endless. Thick rugs muffled my steps, and the air carried the scent of old books mixed with the faint aroma of expensive tobacco. When the double doors opened, the world seemed to slow. Vincenzo Moretti was there, behind a dark wooden desk, surrounded by shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. His gaze lifted from a paper, and for an instant, everything I'd felt in that alley came rushing back. His presence was a physical force, not in what he said, but in what he didn't need to say. "Sit," he said, without a smile, without preamble. I obeyed. My hands were sweating, but I kept my gaze steady. He watched me for a few seconds before speaking again. "My son Adrian owes his life to you." The sentence sounded almost like a statement, not gratitude. "I only did what anyone would have done," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. He lit a cigar, the sound of the lighter breaking the silence like a small explosion. He inhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on me. "Most people would have looked away. You didn't. That tells me more about you than you might realize." The words hung in the air. I didn't know how to respond. There was something dangerous in how he analyzed every gesture, as if searching for something even I didn't know I had. "I want to offer you a job," he said finally. "You'll look after Adrian. He's recovering and needs someone trustworthy around him, someone who doesn't belong to this world." The proposal hit me like a blow disguised as kindness. "Mr. Moretti, I appreciate it, but I can't. I have my job, and—" He raised a hand, cutting me off with sharp elegance. "You don't understand. When life places someone in my path, Elena, there's always a reason. Perhaps fate has chosen a role for you that you don't yet comprehend." A dense silence followed. I stared at him, trying to decipher what lay behind that serenity. Vincenzo didn't seem to be offering an opportunity. He seemed to be dictating an inevitability. The weight of his words surrounded me from all sides. And, against all reason, I nodded. In the days that followed, my life began to revolve around that house. The diner became a distant memory, replaced by a routine of long hallways, locked doors, and gazes that seemed to weigh every step I took. The staff spoke little, and when they did, it was with care, as if every word could echo where it shouldn't. The head butler, Salvatore, gave me my first instructions. "Here, miss, loyalty is worth more than blood, and silence, more than gold." Looking after Adrian wasn't difficult, but it was strange. The boy rarely smiled. There was a shadow in his eyes that didn't come from physical pain alone. It seemed to carry the burden of a life he hadn't even lived yet. When I tried to talk to him, he responded politely, but with a reserve that left me uneasy. Slowly, I realized his wound ran deeper than his body could show. At night, the distant sound of cars arriving and leaving echoed through the hallways. There were meetings that were never mentioned, voices that rose briefly and then fell silent, as if remembering something dangerous. I learned to recognize the rhythm of the house, the veiled tension that dominated the air. Every door slam, every step in the corridor carried a meaning I didn't understand. Vincenzo rarely appeared, but when he did, the atmosphere shifted. It was as if the house itself stood taller. His eyes always found mine, even if just for a fleeting moment. And in them was something that mixed judgment and curiosity, a silent test. I felt he was watching me, not just as an employee, but as someone who, somehow, challenged him without intending to. One afternoon, I found him in the library. He was reading, his face partially obscured by cigar smoke. "Getting used to it?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the book. "Trying," I replied. He closed the volume calmly and looked up. "People think power corrupts, but what truly destroys a man is the fear of losing what he loves." That sentence stuck with me. I left the room with my heart racing, unsure if he was speaking of himself or me. Slowly, I began to understand what the Moretti world represented, a prison disguised as a palace where every gesture was calculated and every emotion controlled. Yet there was something in Vincenzo that defied this logic, a glimmer of humanity that appeared in the most unexpected moments. When he ran his hand through his son's hair, when he gazed out the window with a distant look, as if recalling a life lost to time. As the weeks passed, I realized that job wasn't just a favor, it was a delicate trap, and I, who always believed I controlled my own fate, began to understand that there were forces at play that laughed at my naivety. On the third night after my hiring, As I walked down the corridor toward Adrian's room, I heard two male voices in the distance. I recognized one immediately, Vincenzo's. "She's different," he was saying. "She doesn't see the danger, and maybe that's why she reminds me of what I've forgotten." The other voice replied something I couldn't hear, but those words were enough. I, the woman who saved his son by chance, was now part of a memory he wanted, or feared, to relive. That night, as I lay down, I realized something in me was changing. It wasn't love yet. It was something deeper, more primal. A mix of fascination and fear, like someone watching a fire and knowing one wrong step could mean destruction. The Moretti house was no longer just a place where I worked. It was a mirror beginning to show me who I was when the walls watched in silence. And, perhaps without realizing it, I had already crossed the line between duty and destiny. The winter seemed reluctant to leave. The Moretti mansion, surrounded by motionless pines and high walls, lived in a state of eternal twilight, as if the sun feared crossing its windows. I'd grown accustomed to the sound of boots echoing in the corridors, the smell of strong coffee the guards drank at dawn, the way everyone averted their eyes when Vincenzo's name was mentioned. I also learned to recognize the weight of silence, a silence born not of peace, but of caution. Here, words had the power to open wounds. Salvatore, the butler, was the first to warn me. "Here, Miss Duarte, there are questions that must not be asked, not even with your eyes." I'd smiled, thinking it an exaggeration, but I soon understood. The mansion wasn't just a house. It was a living organism, where every door hid a secret. Every room seemed to have witnessed something that shouldn't be remembered. And yet, there was a dark beauty within. The red carpets, the heavy curtains, the distant sound of a piano played on nights when the wind felt too much to bear. Caring for Adrian became routine, but also a kind of emotional anchor. The boy was recovering physically, but his mind seemed to live elsewhere. There were moments when I found him staring out the window, as if searching for a freedom he'd never had. "You think too much for someone so young," I told him once, trying to coax a smile. He looked away. "My father says thinking too much can kill you before your time." That sentence pierced me. It was the kind of thought born within the iron walls of power, where vulnerability was a luxury that came at a high price. In the early days, I tried to keep my distance from Vincenzo. He was the center of gravity in that house. Everything orbited around him, even when he wasn't there. But fate, once again, seemed determined to pull me into the same orbit. One night, I went out to the garden. The moon hid behind clouds, and the air smelled of damp earth. I needed to breathe something that wasn't fear. The wind rustled the dry leaves, and the sound reminded me of the sea, a sea I'd never seen but always imagined as the place where free people heal. It was there, among the shadows of the trees, that I heard his voice. "You don't belong to this world, Elena." The voice came from behind me, deep and calm, as if it didn't need to ask permission from the silence. I turned and saw him, Vincenzo, in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on me. The light from the porch outlined him, and for a moment, he seemed more human than the Iron Man everyone feared. "Then why do you keep me here?" I asked. He walked slowly until he was close enough for me to smell the tobacco mixed with the cold, because sometimes the innocent see what we've forgotten to notice. No more words followed, just that thick silence that said more than any confession. His gaze rested on me for a few seconds too long, then drifted away. He didn't need to say it. There was something there even he didn't understand, a tension born from the clash of two worlds that should never have touched. From that night on, something began to change. Vincenzo appeared more often, sometimes passing me in the hallway, sometimes watching from a distance as I read to Adrian. He didn't smile, but there was a silent care in his gestures, almost imperceptible. A glass of wine left on the table for me. A passing remark. "Rest early tonight. Close the windows, it's going to rain." Small signs that, within the feared man, there was someone who remembered what it was to care. But power always demands its price. And in that house, the cost was conscience. I began to overhear fragmented conversations from upstairs, meetings held late at night, harsh, tense voices, and names I learned not to repeat. Santoro, Bellini, Marcello. Each name carried a piece of shadow, and I began to understand that what sustained that fortune wasn't gold, but fear. One morning, I found Salvatore standing in the hallway, his face pale. "Stay away from the East Wing, miss. The Don has requested discretion." "What's there?" He just looked at me, and in that look was the plea of someone who'd seen too much. "Just doors, miss, and not all of them should be opened. But the human heart is curious, and curiosity is a disguised form of courage." On a rainy afternoon, when the house seemed asleep, I passed by the East Wing. A door was slightly ajar, and a cold breeze escaped from within. I heard a metallic sound, like the click of a gun being assembled. Before I could step back, a voice cut through the air. I said that wasn't a place for you. Vincenzo was there, in the dimness, a disassembled revolver on the table. There was no anger in his voice, just a statement. He walked toward me, slow, his eyes fixed. Curiosity can be deadly in this house. My blood drained from my face. I'm sorry. I didn't know. He let out a faint sigh. Knowing too much is what kills us first, Elena. The rest is just consequence. He turned, put the gun away, and before leaving added, Don't come back here. I don't want to see your name among the things I lose. After that, the days felt different. The air in the mansion grew denser, as if it breathed through us. Vincenzo had revealed something deeper than any secret. The burden he carried wasn't just power, but guilt. Over time, I learned that his wife, Isabella, had been killed years before in an attack by the Santoro family. A planned strike meant to hit him, but wounded him more cruelly. Since then, he'd never let anyone get close. The Moretti Empire was his shield and his prison, and yet, he began to look at me as if recognizing something long forgotten. One night, when Adrian was already asleep, I found him in the garden again. He was smoking, his gaze lost in the overcast sky. Do you think of her? I asked, unsure if I was going too far. He stayed silent for a while, then answered, I do. But more than her, I think of the man I was before she died. He's gone, and maybe that's what hurts. I couldn't say anything. We stood there, side by side, the cold trying to pull us apart, the silence trying to bind us. And in that moment, I understood. Power is just the facade of something more tragic, the need to control what the heart couldn't save. I saw in Vincenzo a man torn between rage and memory, between the dawn and the widower, between command and emptiness. And somehow, I began to feel that fate hadn't brought me there by chance. Time passed, not in days, but in glances, gestures, and silences. Each time he crossed my path, something in me stirred. Not love yet, but its prelude. I didn't know it, but I was already trapped, not by chains or threats, but by the mystery of a man carrying the ruins of everything he'd ever loved. The following weeks brought a kind of calm that didn't feel real, a fragile truce held together by silences and measured glances. Winter began to give way to the distant promise of spring, but inside the Moretti mansion, the cold seemed eternal. Every wall still whispered stories no one dared tell, and every face carried a shadow time couldn't erase. I'd learned to walk the corridors without making a sound, to avoid the guards' gazes, and to sense when something invisible stirred in the air, the kind of tension that precedes a storm. Vincenzo appeared at irregular intervals, always surrounded by men and secrets. Sometimes he passed me in the hallways, and our eyes met for just a moment, enough to feel the weight of a presence that defied the very space. It was as if every unspoken word carried the risk of changing everything. I tried to convince myself my life there was simple. Care for Adrian, follow orders, don't interfere. But deep down, I knew neutrality was impossible. In houses like that, even silence takes a side. Adrian improved daily. He walked in the garden again, read with me, asked questions about the world beyond the high walls. His innocence reminded me of what lightness was, and maybe that's why Vincenzo kept me around. I was a harmless distraction, a fragment of normalcy in a reality tainted by fear. But even distractions can become dangerous when they touch the heart of those who watch. That morning, the Don had left early for a meeting out of town. The routine seemed calm, and Adrian had insisted on going to a school field trip. Vincenzo agreed, on the condition that I accompany him personally, along with 2 guards. The day dawned clear. The sky finally blue after months of gray. For the first time, I felt life might perhaps be normal again. The car was on the road when I noticed something odd. A dark vehicle followed us at a constant distance, like a discreet shadow. At first I thought it was a coincidence, but as we changed routes it stayed there. I glanced at the driver, who kept his eyes fixed on the road, pretending not to notice. The air inside the car grew heavy. Adrian played with his phone, oblivious to what was happening. But I couldn't take my eyes off the rearview mirror. The car behind accelerated in the same curves, with the same timing. My body reacted before my mind could process. "Stop the car," I ordered, my voice not sounding like my own. The guard at the wheel shot me a brief, confused look. "We can't stop here, miss. Do what I'm telling you." He hesitated for just a second. The car slowed, and the one behind did too. It was the confirmation I dreaded. The road narrowed, flanked by trees. There was no easy escape. Instinct took over. I shouted for Adrian to duck and pushed the seat in front of him. The sharp sound of gunfire came almost at the same time. The glass shattered, the car swerved, and chaos erupted. It was seconds that felt like hours. One of the guards fired back. I just shielded the boy, my body covering his, my heart pounding as if it might break through my chest. The smell of gunpowder mixed with fear. And then, everything stopped. The car that had followed us sped off, disappearing around a curve. Adrian was trembling but unharmed. The wounded guard in the shoulder groaned softly, and I grabbed his phone with shaking hands. I dialed the number I knew by heart, one I never thought I'd use. When Vincenzo's voice answered, cold and controlled as always, mine came out halting. They tried to kill us. There was a brief silence, followed by a tone I'll never forget. Where are you? 20 minutes later, the sky was filled with the sound of engines. Black cars appeared like steel specters, and Vincenzo was the first to step out. There was no rage on his face, just a determination that scared me more than anger. He looked at his son, the wounded guard, and then at me. He said nothing, just made a slight nod, a silent order for me to go with him. That night, he summoned me to his office. The room was steeped in a bluish dimness, the air thick with tobacco and tension. Vincenzo paced back and forth, his coat open, sleeves rolled up to his forearms. An old scar on his wrist gleamed under the lamp's light. When he spoke, his voice was a mix of control and storm. You have a survivor's instinct. People like that aren't born by accident. I didn't know what to say. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. When you answered that phone that night, when you stayed by my son's side, when you defied me without realizing it, in every gesture, you showed you're not an ordinary woman. You see danger before it sees you. I swallowed hard, unable to meet the intensity of his gaze. I just did what needed to be done, and that's what scares me. Those words hung between us, like a secret. Vincenzo took another step closer. I felt his warmth, even from a distance. The air seemed to vibrate, and for a moment I feared not the man before me, but what he was beginning to awaken within me. The tension between us became a constant, silent, almost tangible presence. It was in the glances that lingered too long, in the pauses between sentences, in the moments our paths crossed without reason. He tested me with simple questions, and I realized he was trying to understand me, perhaps even protect me from something I didn't yet comprehend. But the war in the shadows didn't stop. The Santoro family, old rivals, were moving again, and now they knew my name. The threats began subtly. An envelope left at the gate with an old photo of my neighbor Teresa, the elderly woman who'd been like a mother to me. Then, an anonymous message, short and cruel. Every good deed has its price. When I showed it to Vincenzo, he wasn't surprised. He just ordered my security tightened and told me not to go out alone. They're trying to get to me through you. And what will you do? What I always do. Survive first. Avenge later. The way he said avenge made the air freeze. That night, as the wind battered the mansion's windows, I realized fear had become a constant companion. Not fear of death, but of losing something I couldn't yet name. Loyalty, I understood, is a disguised form of love. And love, in that world, was the most dangerous thing anyone could feel. I began to see that by saving that boy that night, I hadn't just changed the course of my life. I'd lit a spark in a field of gunpowder, and time, patient and relentless, was already counting down to the explosion. The day dawned with the kind of silence that precedes bad news. The wind carried a cold that didn't come from the weather, but from the soul. I'd woken early, as always, but the air felt denser, the clock slower, as if time itself was bracing for collapse. Deep down, I sensed it. Something was about to happen, and it didn't take long for my intuition to be confirmed. When I descended the stairs, I found Salvatore waiting for me in the foyer. His face, usually impassive, betrayed unease. "Miss Duarte," he said in a grave tone, "there's something you need to see." I followed him to Vincenzo's office. He was standing, leaning against the desk, his gaze fixed on an envelope on the wooden surface. The lit cigar trembled slightly between his fingers. For him, the equivalent of a scream. "Read." I took the paper with trembling hands. It was a few words, written in jagged, scrawled letters. "The woman you protect has debts from the past. We want what's ours. Teresa is with us." The name cut through me like a blade. Teresa, the elderly neighbor who'd taken me in when I had nothing, who shared her bread and stories of her youth from a worn rocking chair. I could barely breathe. "They kidnapped her?" I asked, my voice breaking. Vincenzo nodded slowly. "The Santoro family wants a reckoning. They want me to come out of hiding. They think they can make me chase a ghost trail. And what will you do?" He lifted his gaze, and for a second, I saw the man the world feared. "What I always do when they touch someone who belongs to me." That sentence echoed within me, cruel and protective at once. I knew Teresa had nothing to do with their games. She was innocent, and it was because of me that they'd taken her. Guilt weighed like lead. "I'm going with you," I declared, my voice steady despite the fear. "No," he replied almost without hesitation. "This isn't your world." "Maybe not, but you brought it to me." For a moment his gaze faltered. It was brief, but enough for me to notice. His decision was already made. He just didn't want to admit it. Hours later, we were on our way. The car sped down the road under a steel-colored sky. Vincenzo kept his eyes fixed ahead, his jaw clenched. In the back seat, a briefcase rested, and inside it, the certainty that the meeting wouldn't end in words. The abandoned warehouse where the Santoros set their traps was on the city's outskirts, surrounded by rusted tracks and tall weeds. The kind of place where time seems forgotten, and hope, non-existent. Vincenzo looked at me before we got out of the car. "If things go south, you run. Understood?" "I'm not running. Don't defy me now." "I'm not defying you. I'm staying." His gaze hardened, but there was something else. Fear. Not for himself, but for me. And that was exactly what weakened him. We entered. The air smelled of rust and vengeance. Dim lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the filthy floor. The sound of our footsteps echoed like an omen. Teresa was tied to a chair in the center of the warehouse, her face bruised but still defiant, as if daring fear to touch her. "Vincenzo Moretti," a voice emerged from the shadows, hoarse and laden with contempt. "You finally showed up for our meeting." It was Luca Santoro, the man who had inherited his father's rage and empire, young, impulsive, with a smile that overflowed with hatred and arrogance. He walked slowly toward us, flanked by 2 armed men. "You came with little protection for a man of your stature." "I didn't come to talk about numbers," Vincenzo replied, cold. "Release the woman." Luca smiled. "You think you can still give orders, Don Moretti? All I care about is watching your empire burn. And maybe, as a bonus, what's left of your heart too." He looked at me as he said it, with a cynicism that made my stomach churn. Vincenzo reacted instinctively. A step forward, his body between me and the enemy. "She has nothing to do with this." "Oh, she does," Luca shot back. "She's the reason you're here." And before I could react, the first shot rang out. The sound reverberated off the metal walls, followed by shouts and chaos. Instinct took over. I ran to Teresa, untying her with trembling hands. Vincenzo and his men returned fire, the scene descending into a hell of gunpowder and smoke. The air reeked of blood and iron. Luca tried to flee, but Vincenzo caught him. Their confrontation was quick and brutal, the rage of years exploding in seconds. I saw Vincenzo grab him by the collar, his eyes burning with fury. "You killed my wife, and now you want to touch the one I still breathe for." Luca smiled, spitting blood. "You have no soul, Moretti. You only know how to destroy what you love." Vincenzo hesitated, just long enough for Luca to reach for a fallen gun. The shot rang out, and time froze. By reflex, I lunged, pushing Vincenzo aside. The bullet grazed my arm, burning like fire. He reacted in an instant. A second shot ended Luca Santoro's life with cold precision. The silence that followed was almost sacred. The echo of the final shot still lingered as Vincenzo knelt beside me, his hands firmly pressing my wounded arm. His eyes, always so controlled, were filled with something I'd never seen. Desperation. "Why did you do that?" "Because sometimes running doesn't save you." He pressed the wound, blood seeping through his fingers. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the world around us vanished. The noise, the fear, everything. Just us and the cost of what we dared to touch. We made it out alive. Teresa was shaken but safe. Vincenzo drove us back in silence, his face masked with the weight of more guilt than victory. When the car passed through the mansion's gates, the night felt heavier than usual. Before I got out of the car, he looked at me. "Do you understand now what it means to be near me?" "I understand, but what scares me isn't the danger. It's the thought that if I leave, I might never feel anything again." He didn't respond. He just looked away, as if my words had struck something he didn't know how to protect. That night, lying in my room, I realized there was no turning back. The blood on my skin was already the seal of this invisible pact. Saving his son's life had been the beginning. Saving his was the point of no return. And though my body ached, what truly burned was what was starting to grow inside me, something between tenderness and damnation. Love, in that world, wasn't salvation. It was a sentence. Vincenzo's body was still covered in dried blood when we returned to the mansion. The night seemed to drag in its own time, still and silent, as if the world had paused to witness the consequences of what we'd done. The war between the Morettis and the Santoros might have ended, but within me and him, Another war was beginning, far more intimate and dangerous. The kind of war fought without weapons, but capable of destroying what little soul remained. The car pulled up to the main entrance. Salvatore rushed to open the door, his eyes wide as he saw the state of the dawn. Vincenzo ignored the worried looks of his men and walked straight inside, his boots leaving red stains on the pale marble. I followed, clutching my throbbing arm, unsure if it was the physical pain or what came after it that made me tremble. He stopped in the hallway and turned to me. "Come with me." His voice was hoarse, tired, yet still commanding. I followed him to the office, the same place where everything seemed to begin and end. The windows were open, letting in the cold early morning breeze. He tossed his blood-stained coat over a chair and sat down, his body leaning forward, breathing heavily. "You need a doctor," I murmured. "I don't need anyone." But the blood dripped from his torn sleeve and his gaze wavered. The arrogance of power gave way to the fragility of the man. I went to the shelf, grabbing the first aid kit I knew was there. He watched me in silence, not stopping me. The yellowish light of the lamp made the cut look even deeper. I approached, and when I touched his shoulder, he flinched, not from pain, but from the shock of being touched. "Why didn't you run when you had the chance?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I kept cleaning the wound, avoiding his gaze. "Because running isn't always what saves you." He let out a humorless laugh, the kind that carried more melancholy than joy. "You talk like someone who's not afraid of death. Maybe I'm just afraid of living half a life." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The distant sound of rain blended with the rhythm of our silences. When I finally looked up, he was already watching me. There was something new in his eyes, a recognition, as if, suddenly, he had found in me the mirror of everything he'd tried to bury. The pain, the tenderness, the desire to start over. I finished bandaging his shoulder and stepped back. Vincenzo stood slowly, his gaze still fixed on me. For a moment, I thought he'd say something, a thank you perhaps. But what came was the most intense silence that had ever existed between us. A silence that said everything words couldn't contain. He stepped closer. The scent of tobacco mixed with blood and rain created a bittersweet, dangerous, and irresistible perfume. "You should rest," he murmured, "and you should stop thinking you can control everything." He looked away, but the corner of his mouth hinted at what could have been a smile. "And if I told you I've already lost control?" My heart stopped for a moment. There was something in the way he said it, not a confession, but a warning, as if loving for him was just another way to put someone in danger. In the days that followed, the house sank into an odd calm. No cars arrived, no visitors came. The world outside might still have been at war, but within those walls, a tense peace reigned. Vincenzo spent more time on the terrace, staring at the city, his gaze distant. I saw him, always at the same time, always alone. There was a weight on his shoulders that even his expensive suits couldn't hide. One night, I went to him. The cold breeze made the curtains dance, and the sound of bells from the nearby church reminded me of the time that insisted on passing. "Don't you ever sleep?" I asked, trying to break the barrier. "Sleep is a luxury men like me don't have. And love?" He turned slowly. The question hung between us, challenging the space and the past. "Love," he repeated, "is the one mistake you don't repeat. After you lose someone because of it, your heart learns that feeling is dangerous." I took a step toward him. "And what if the danger is what keeps you alive?" Vincenzo looked away, and for a moment, I saw the man behind the dawn, tired, weary of wars, hungry for something power could never give him. He stepped closer until our breaths mingled. The distance between us ceased to exist. His touch was light, hesitant, as if asking permission from fate. The kiss wasn't one of passion, but of surrender. A gesture that said, "We're doomed, but not alone." The world could destroy us, but in that moment, it was just us, and the fragile illusion that love could be greater than guilt. When he pulled away, there was something like sadness in his eyes. "This shouldn't have happened." "But it did," I replied. He closed his eyes, and what I saw was a man fighting himself. The days that followed were a mix of silence and tension. The lines between right and wrong no longer existed. I was no longer just the woman who saved the Mafia boss's son. I was the woman the boss himself couldn't let go of. One night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Vincenzo entered without knocking. He carried a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "For one night without guilt," he said, pouring the dark liquid. "Guilt never sleeps," I replied, smiling bitterly. He raised his glass. "Then let's drink until it does." We drank in silence, the wine warming what fear had chilled. The hours melted away until his body leaned against mine, like someone finally accepting their own weakness. There were no promises, no words, just the murmur of our breaths blending with the distant sound of rain. And that night, I understood something time wouldn't erase. Love and death smell the same, the scent of something inevitable. When I woke, he was gone. Only a note on the table. Some men are born to protect, others to destroy. I am both. I folded the paper and tucked it against my chest, knowing every word was true. From then on, the love growing between us wasn't a refuge, it was fate. And fate, as always, had already chosen its price. The war seemed to have finally ended, but the scars it left within us were deeper than any visible wound. The days that followed passed under a suspicious calm, as if the world had merely paused to catch its breath before the next storm. The Moretti mansion had become an odd sanctuary, a place where danger slept behind the walls, and life, clumsily, tried to learn to be simple again. The sun returned, filtering through the tall windows and painting the heavy curtains gold. I watched him from afar, like someone trying to decipher an ancient language. Vincenzo seemed the same man, stern, impenetrable, but there was something new in his way of being. The weight that once bowed him now seemed shared, and though he never said it, I knew. Part of that lightness came from me. Adrian returned to his routine, smiling again. He ran through the gardens as if the walls didn't exist. Sometimes, watching him play, I wondered how many childhoods had been stolen to keep that empire alive. Vincenzo watched him with an expression that mixed pride and pain. Fatherhood, for him, was both a punishment and a blessing, a living reminder of what he'd lost and what he could still lose. One morning, I found him on the terrace. The breeze blew from the lake, carrying the distant scent of magnolias. He leaned against the railing, dressed in a dark suit, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, I hesitated to interrupt that silent portrait, but he spoke first, without turning. "You've brought light to this place, Elena. And light is what terrifies men like me the most." His voice sounded tired, but there was a tone of surrender in it. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in a rhythm I knew well. "Light doesn't choose where it shines, Vincenzo." He turned, and what I saw in his eyes disarmed me completely. It was no longer the gaze of the dawn, the man who ruled with iron and fear. It was the gaze of someone who, for the first time, allowed himself to be human. "Stay," he said, almost in a whisper. "Not as an employee, not as someone who owes me anything. Stay because this house only feels alive when you're in it." Those words hit me like a disguised confession, and at the same time, like a liberation. I didn't respond. I just stood there beside him, the wind tousling our hair, the silence between us so eloquent it needed no promises. Time passed in gentle slowness. The nights no longer held fear, and the sound of footsteps in the corridors felt less threatening. Vincenzo, little by little, began to abandon his weapons, not the iron ones, but those he used to protect his heart. He was still the dawn to the world, but with me, he was just a man trying to remember how to breathe without the weight of power. One afternoon, Adrian burst into the office carrying a drawing. It was simple, done in colored pencils. 3 figures in front of a house, with an oversized sun in the sky. "It's us," he said, with the carefree smile of someone who doesn't know fear. "You, Daddy, and me." Vincenzo stared at the drawing for long seconds before responding. His hardened face softened, and a slight tremor ran through the hand holding the paper. "Beautiful," he said simply, but his voice broke. When Adrian left, leaving us alone, he showed me the drawing again. "Do you have any idea what this means?" "That he sees a home," I replied. He nodded, looking at the paper as if it carried an impossible weight. "And that's exactly what I fear. A home is a man like me's most vulnerable point." I sat across from him. "But it's also the only place where the soul can rest." He looked at me in silence. And in that moment, I realized that all the armor the world had forced upon him was starting to crumble. The dawn everyone feared was dying there, before me, giving way to the man he'd always tried to hide. The man tired of being a legend, of living among ghosts. That night, the sky was clear, and the breeze carried the distant sound of cathedral bells. I couldn't sleep. I went to the window and saw him again on the terrace, motionless, like a shadow silhouetted against the moonlight. I went down quietly and walked to him. When I arrived, he spoke without looking at me. "There are things a man like me can never have. Love is one of them." "Then why do you ask me to stay?" He took a deep breath. "Because when you're around, I believe, even if just for a moment, that I can be someone different." We stood there side by side, the world dissolving around us. The city slept, indifferent to the silent miracle unfolding on that terrace. His hand brushed mine, light, almost shy. There was no fiery passion, no vows, just the quiet understanding of 2 weary souls recognizing each other in the dark. The days that followed flowed with an improbable serenity. The Moretti Empire remained silent, and the Santoros, what was left of them, had vanished. For the first time, peace seemed possible. But something inside me said that certain stories don't end. They just sleep. One morning, I woke to the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. Salvatore knocked on the door. The Don left, said he needed to handle something personal. Alone. Fear pierced me like a knife. I rushed downstairs, but he was already gone. The black car disappeared through the gates. I stood there frozen, with the feeling that fate, once again, was demanding its price. 3 days passed. His silence was an abyss. Then, on a rainy afternoon, I heard the familiar engine. He was back. He walked in soaked, his coat drenched, his gaze exhausted. Before I could say anything, he pulled me into a tight, intense, almost desperate embrace. "It's over," he murmured. "For the first time in years, it's over." I felt his body tremble, as if an entire lifetime was unraveling in that gesture. And I understood. The Don was ceasing to exist. The man, Vincenzo, was finally breathing. That night, we sat by the fireplace. He spoke little. He just looked at me, as if he needed to memorize the moment before the world called him back. "You know what's hardest?" he asked. "Keeping power is easy. What's hard is learning to live without it. Maybe it's time to learn." He smiled, a brief but genuine smile. "And if what's left of me doesn't know how, then I'll teach you." The fire reflected in his eyes, and there, for the first time, I saw peace. When the sun rose, Vincenzo went to the garden. I followed silently. He stopped by the fountain, hands in his pockets, and looked at the sky. "I don't think I ever told you how I met Isabella," he said, his voice almost lost in the wind. "She found me on a street much like the one where I found you, bleeding, wounded. And somehow she believed I could be saved. Were you?" He looked at me. "Maybe only now." The distant sound of the city blended with the tolling of a bell. Time seemed suspended. Vincenzo took a deep breath, as if handing his burden to the wind, and then he smiled. Not the smile of a victorious boss, but that of a man who, finally, allowed himself to be merely human. Later, when he left to take Adrian to school, I stayed alone by the window. The city was waking, and the morning light bathed the world in a soft gold. For the first time since that night in the alley, I felt I could breathe without fear. I looked at my reflection in the glass and barely recognized the woman staring back. The frightened waitress had become part of a story no one would believe. And yet, everything in me felt strangely right. I thought of his words. "Whoever saves a Moretti is never the same again." He was right. I wasn't the same. Fate, capricious as it was, had pulled me from the darkness to show me that even monsters carry humanity, and that sometimes a look, a gesture, a touch is enough to remind someone what it means to be alive. As the morning breeze stirred the curtains, his memory filled the air. I closed my eyes and let his voice echo in my mind. He was the man everyone feared, and I, the woman who dared to look at the monster and see the man. And so love, between fear and redemption, made the impossible our home. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share in the comments what moved you the most. Your engagement keeps the flame alive that inspires us to keep going.